After losing his daughter in infancy, David became quick-tempered and withdrawn. He never talked about her death, instead burying himself in work. Over time, he developed a drinking problem and began to experience chronic back pain. It wasn't until years later in therapy that he recognized his anger and addiction were grief in disguise. Welcome to this mini-series on understanding the language of grief, loss, and trauma. My name is Nathalie Himmelrich. I'm a somatic practitioner, psychological therapist, educator, and author, specializing in grief and trauma, and the host of the How to Deal with Grief and Trauma podcast. Grief and trauma are deeply human experiences, yet many of us struggle to describe what we are going through or to understand what others are facing. The vocabulary of loss is vast, varied, and sometimes overwhelming. In this short podcast episode series, we'll explore the different types of grief, loss, and trauma that people encounter throughout life. Each mini-episode serves both as an educational tool and a compassionate companion for anyone trying to make sense of their own experience with grief, loss, and trauma, or someone who is supporting someone else who is. These terms are more than labels. They are doorways into greater understanding, healing, and connection. Whether you are a bereaved parent, a caregiver, a therapist, or someone walking alongside a grieving friend or someone who has experienced trauma, these bite-sized episodes aim to give you language, insight, and tools. Each one includes a definition, some key considerations, an explanation of why it matters, relevant podcast episodes, and frequently asked questions that I have been asked by my clients and you, the listener of the podcast. And my answers are all grounded in both professional and lived experience. So let's begin. So masked grief occurs when the emotional pain of loss is expressed through other symptoms, often physical or behavioral, rather than openly recognized as grief. The bereaved may not realize that their struggles, such as chronic pain, depression, addiction, or interpersonal issues, are connected to unresolved grief. Masked grief often manifests in indirect, unexpected ways. People may become irritable, angry, reckless, or physically ill without making the connection to the loss they've experienced. It is especially common in cultures or families where emotional expression is discouraged, or among people who were never given space to grieve openly. Because it hides behind other symptoms, masked grief is frequently misdiagnosed or overlooked. This is really important to understand because masked grief and understanding masked grief helps identify hidden grief that may be causing emotional or physical distress. So recognizing the root of the pain can be the first step towards healing. By naming grief and giving space to be felt, people can begin to release the energy it has been using to mask itself and move towards integration. In many of the conversations I had for the How to Deal with Grief and Trauma podcast, interviewers referred to never fully grieving historical losses, some of which they might have masked with other symptoms. There's also other examples as, for example, clients who developing compulsive behaviors after loss, or people showing up with behaviors such as rage, OCD, or substance use. Or another example could be a teacher whose burnout can be traced back to an unresolved childhood death, or a teenager who might begin self-harming after losing a sibling but never cried or spoke about the loss. So you might ask yourself, how can I tell if I have masked grief? So look for physical, emotional, or behavioral symptoms that began after the loss, but were not recognized as grief. Go check them out with your medical doctor and sort of trace back in time when they started. Because mass grief is very common, especially among people who weren't given the time or tools to process their grief. So what does mass grief look like in children? They may show up as regression, behavioral problems, withdrawal, or difficulty concentrating. So can therapy help reveal mass grief? Absolutely, because therapy provides a safe space, or should provide a safe space, to uncover connections between past losses and present struggles. Again, I highly recommend to find a grief-literate, trauma-informed therapist to do that, and someone who is focusing or mainly using somatic approaches. So what's the difference between masked and inhibited grief? So inhibited grief is consciously pushed aside. Masked grief is typically unconscious and expressed through symptoms the person doesn't recognize as grief. So therefore it's really good to have someone helping you recognize and draw the connections, such as a therapist or a doctor who's understanding in grief and especially in masked grief. So why might someone develop masked grief? This is just a coping mechanism. Grief is an energy in the body, and it may be felt too dangerous or unacceptable to express, so the mind and body redirect it into other symptoms. Is it possible to experience both masked and absent grief? Yes. These forms often overlap and may transition into one another over time. So maybe go back and listen to absent grief. And for those who support people with grief, how can I support someone with masked grief? So approach with curiosity and compassion. Instead of confronting the grief directly, validate the pain they're expressing and gently explore what might lie beneath. Because masked grief occurs when the emotional pain of loss is expressed through other symptoms or when it has been too big. So be aware of that and not openly address it head on. The next episode is about chronic grief, so come back and listen. I hope this episode has helped you feel more grounded in the language of loss, grief, or trauma, and maybe even offered you some clarity, validation, or insight into your own experience or the experience of someone you care about. Grief and trauma are deeply personal, yet universal. When we can name what we're feeling, we take one powerful step closer to healing and the integration of our experience back into our life. If this series resonates with you, I invite you to keep exploring. You'll find more resources, courses, and ways to work with me at nathaliehimmelrich.com. And of course, you're always welcome to revisit any of the episodes whenever you need a gentle reminder that you're not alone. Until next time, take good care of your heart.